Before we get started, let's go ahead and create our project in Unity and make sure that we add it into source control properly. Now, I kind of wanted to break this out into its own video because the process of using Unity with source control can be a little confusing to people. So I want to go through each one of the steps required in order to get this properly set up with using a local Git repository. So the first step is to go ahead and create our Unity project. I'm going to go over to Create New Project, and I'm going to go into a folder that doesn't exist. Yay. So I'm going to go into this folder, and I'm going to create my project folder. However, this isn't going to be the folder I want to create the Unity project inside of. Now, I want the repository to be sitting at this level, but I want another folder inside of this level to contain our actual Unity project. And the reason is I often find that it's useful to have additional room within your project, quote unquote, for things such as documentation, build scripts, additional solutions within Visual Studio or additional projects, as well as builds and all of that fun stuff. So I like to contain some ancillary files inside of some logical unit. So to do that, I need to place the actual Unity project in a subfolder of my project, but that introduces a small problem because Unity names a project based off the folder that it exists under. That's unfortunate because what I would like to do is I would like to create something like that. I'd like to have all my Unity project, all my assets and my library folder and that fun stuff inside of a folder called Unity. The problem is Unity will then refer to this project as Unity.
That could get confusing.
Yeah, it gets confusing, especially when you have a bunch of projects set up this way, and then you have you look through your recent projects, it's like, okay, so there's like 5 different projects called Unity, and it just gets annoying. So I used to do it
So
like
does that mean that we have to have a subfolder with the same name as our main folder?
That's pretty much what I'm going to do.
All right.
And I just wanted to point out that that's why I'm doing this. It's a little weird looking, but it ultimately is the best trade-off between sanity and cleanliness.
So thank you, Unity.
Yeah, pretty much. So anyway, so now that I've created my subfolder called BuzzLancer, I'm going to select this folder as the project and hit create. So remember, again, I did that so I have additional room inside of my folder, or inside of my project or repository, to place additional files. Okay, so now that we have this all set up, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple things. And I'm going to do these couple things not so that we actually get started building our project, but just so people can have some context about what's going on while we add this into source control. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save my scene. Now my scene is going to be saved into my assets folder. I'm going to create a subfolder called scenes, like usual. And then I'm actually going to create another subfolder called garbage. Now remember, this project is going to get very large, especially over the course of these video series. So I'm going to create the subfolder garbage to place my test scenes. You know, when I want to create a scene just to play around with particle effects, or when I want to create a scene just to test out some specific configuration of game objects, stuff like that before we actually go out and create the game. So I'm going to call this game test as the scene, hit save, and now we have this. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and create some code. Now, I'm just going to go create a new folder, and I'm going to call it code. And I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to call it player. Now, that's just because, well, we're going to have a player mono behavior at some point. It's not so that we're going to fill in any of this code quite yet. But I am going to open this up in Visual Studio. Now the reason I'm doing this is because when you open up a file in Visual Studio for the first time, Unity will go ahead and create a bunch of CSproj and SLN files. Now these CSproj and SLN files are going to be on the list of things that we actually don't want to store inside of our repository. So now that I've done that, I'm going to close back out of Visual Studio. It's created the files, which serves our purpose for this video. So now if I jump into our folder again, we'll see a bunch of stuff that we want to effectively ignore out of our repository, such as our CSprojes, our slins, our SOUs, our temp folder, our OBJ folder, and our resharper folder. So that gives us a nice little roadmap about what we want to ignore so that we can get that step out of the way entirely. Now there's another concern. The other concern is that Unity actually stores additional information along with every one of the assets and folders in a project. At the minimum, Unity likes to uniquely identify assets for purposes that should be fairly obvious. You should be able to uniquely identify an asset outside of its name in case the name changes, blah, blah, blah. And it also will store settings about that asset. For example, you might have a texture, and you might want to tell Unity about things like the clamp or the scale mode or the texture resolution or how it should appear on different devices. Now, all that information can't be stored in the texture itself, which means that information has to be put somewhere. And I'll show you guys where that information is put by default. By default, it's located in the library folder. Now, the library folder, by default, will contain a lot of asset metadata, stored right here in our metadata folder, which you can see right here, along with a bunch of other stuff that is specific to our local machine, things like caches and all that fun stuff. If you commit your library folder to source control and you try to share your code, you will have problems. It is not meant to be committed into source control because it's specific to the computer and it contains a lot of cached information and all that fun stuff, but it does contain information that we do need, such as our metadata. So the way in which Unity works with source control is it allows us to actually change the location of where the metadata is stored so that we can integrate it with source control systems. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. If I go up here to Edit, Project Settings, Editor, we'll see we have a version control option with the mode currently set to disable. That is the default. Now if we bring this drop-down open, or we open this drop-down, we'll see we have four options, two of which are grayed out. We have the asset server, which is a very simple and straightforward version control system made by the folks over at Unity that's used typically in smaller studios. And we have Perforce, which is a more of an industry standard version control system that's used very commonly with games. And then we have metafiles. Now, Asset Server and Perforce are for pro-only features, so we won't be using those. But metafiles are great because once you select this option, you can actually use your Unity project with a variety of source control systems, such as Git, SVN, or Mercurial. So what exactly does this do? Well, if I select this option, I'm just going to hit Control. I don't know if hitting Control S did anything, but I like hitting Control S. Then jump back out into our project, open up our assets folder, we'll see something interesting. All of a sudden, we have these corresponding .meta files associated with every single folder and every single asset in our entire assets folder. So if I go open up our code, we see we have player CS and player CS meta. If I open up scenes and garbage, we have gametest.unity and gametest.unity.meta. So what it's doing now is instead of storing all that meta information inside of our library folder, it's now packaging it up into these files that are sat right next to the assets that they describe, which allows us to ignore the library folder in its entirety, prevent having issues between sharing this code with other computers, and allows us to, well, essentially it does both those things, which in turn allows us to use source control. So it's
Perfect.
amazing. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and create a repository and then put together our gitignore file. So to do that, I'm going to back up all the way into my project root. Now, this isn't the Unity project root. This is my project root. I don't know what else to call it, really. We'll see it become useful later in this series, but when you are creating your repository, you'll want to make sure that you don't put yourself into a corner. So that's why I'm doing this step here before we have any more, or before we have a particular example of when we would want to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this path onto my clipboard. I'm going to open up SourceTree, which SourceTree is the GUI that we're going to be using to work with Git. You could use SmartGit, or you could use the command line if you're into that sort of thing. But we're using SourceTree. You can grab this online. It's free. It's made by Atlassian. Atlassian's awesome. Okay, so go ahead and say clone new. Say create a new repository. Make sure Git is checked because we're not doing Mercurial. Or if you want to do Mercurial, you're more than welcome to. And then just go ahead and dump the destination path right there. So remember, this is the path to my root folder. not to my Unity project.
Yeah, to our big overall folder.
Right. So I'm going to hit create, and we're going to get a Git repository. So let's go ahead and start ignoring some stuff. Now, it's actually really easy to ignore stuff within SourceTree itself. We'll get the process going with SourceTree, then we'll back up and add in some of our own patterns to the file that we're about to generate. So let's go ahead and find something that we obviously want to ignore, such as our library. Let's ignore this. I'm going to right-click Library, hit Ignore, and then I'm going to say Ignore everything beneath buzzlancer/library. Make sure that Ignore for this repository only is checked. Hit OK, and our library goes away, which is good.
Now because that was listed when you pulled up the small screen as just library, it's ignoring everything in the library, not that just one line that
Right.
had library at the end, right?
Yep, because I made that additional check thing on that.
Gotcha.
We can see an example of doing that again with temp. I'm going to right-click this, hit Ignore, and then I'm going to say Ignore everything beneath buzzlancer/temp.
Awesome.
All right, so we got all that fun stuff figured out. Let's go ahead and do that one more time with buzzlancer obj, because I want to completely ignore this obj folder. That's our object files, temp files that are created by the C# compiler. So I'm going to say ignore everything beneath buzzlancer/obj, and hit OK.
But now that does bring up an interesting point. In our case, we're using FBX files for our models. But if you were using OBJ files,
right,
would you have to be more specific?
In this particular case, I'm actually being specific in that I'm selecting a particular folder. However, a lot of gitignore files that you will see that that are given as examples to use with Visual Studio projects will include a pattern that'll ignore all files that end with the OBJ extension, which it could be problematic because if we did have OBJ files like actual models, then it would completely break down. The solution to that is to ignore the specific OBJ folder as opposed to completely ignoring every single OBJ file.
Gotcha.
All right, so that got rid of almost everything we want to ignore, but there's still quite a few things we don't want. For example, we don't want vs.csproj or c#.csproj. That's because these CS projects are generated for us by Unity. We don't want them committed into our repository. So I'm just going to select both of them, hit ignore, and I'm going to say ignore exact file names. Now that's important. We don't want to ignore all CS projects. In the case that we do have additional C# projects inside of our folder, we just want to ignore the specific ones that Unity generates. So I'm going to hit OK. Then I'm going to find our slins, and I'm going to ignore these both. I'm not going to ignore the SOU quite yet. We'll look at that in a second. So I'm going to say ignore exact file names for both our slins. For our SOU, now SOU are user-specific settings for your slins, which means that what I want to do is I want to right-click that, hit ignore, but I want to ignore all files with the SUO extension, not just that specific one. Okay, so we have a lot of stuff ignored, which is good. We have our project settings all there. We have our code and our meta files all there. That's all great. But we have this huge resharper folder, which we want to ignore. However, I don't want to just ignore this resharper folder. I want to ignore all resharper folders that are created underneath our repository. So to do that, I'm actually going to go into our gitignore file and manually edit it. Now this gitignore file was created for us by SourceTree by going through that process. If you don't have SourceTree, these are the line entries that were made for us. So let's go ahead and ignore our resharper. Now that's pretty straightforward. We need to, however, earlier versions of resharper decided to have additional characters at the end of them. So instead of just ignoring resharper, I'm going to say ignore resharper star, just for earlier versions of resharper. So that should get rid of that. Now there are a couple other things that I want to add in here. I want to ignore all bin folders, and I want to ignore all release. folders, and I want to ignore all debug folders in the case that we have additional Visual Studio projects within this. And I also want to ignore our build folder, which we will be creating once we start creating our, I'm going to do /build to make sure it's in the root, when we start creating our standalone players.
So just to be clear, we don't actually have that folder yet. We're just preparing.
Right. And then I want to make sure we get rid of thumbs.db in the case that someone's using XP. I don't know if 7 generates thumbs.db files. Can't remember.
I don't know.
Then we also want to nuke our desktop ini files. You might want to throw in a few more ignore patterns if you're using Mac OS. But yeah, I think this pretty much covers everything that we need to ignore, and this should pretty much carry us through the entirety of this project.
That's outstanding.
So I'm going to close it out and hit save, and refresh. And now that I've refreshed, we see that the only thing we're about to commit are our assets folder and our project settings folder.
And that's exactly where we want to be.
Yep. So I'm going to hit Control A, hit add to index, and then I'm going to commit, and I'm going to say initial commit. Just run through this one more time. Hit commit, and we have now successfully committed a basic, straightforward Unity project into Git.
That's outstanding.
Yep, so lots of fun stuff. It may seem a little convoluted for people who haven't done this before, but you get used to it. And I highly encourage people to use source control, especially when following along with these videos and in their own personal projects. There's no excuse not to, considering that you go ahead and grab source tree for free by Googling it, because I can't remember the domain you get it from.
And even if you are doing a project just on your own, that doesn't mean down the road you won't be working with a team, so you should just be used to doing this, right?
Yeah, because if you are working with the team, this is very important. I can't remember, I can't tell you how many times I've heard horror stories about game development studios not using source control, then losing their files, and then they go out of business.
Which you don't want.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up the introduction to using Git with Unity, and we'll see you guys in the next video.
Awesome.